In our last video, we were looking at the Jamestown, and that colony established by Great Britain, and it was based on a company, and the motive was profit making, and they wanted to come to the New World and get rich. And so we're going to look at two other groups that came from England close to the same time, maybe 15 years later or so, than when Jamestown was established initially. And these two groups came for other reasons. They came for religious freedom. The Pilgrims and the Puritans were two religious groups in England at that time that were being persecuted. And they wanted to be free at last to worship as they please. So we have two different motivations now for coming to the New World. Again, vocabulary: Pilgrims, Mayflower; Separatists, Mayflower Compact; Puritans, Squanto; Purified, and the New England Way. First, we're going to talk about the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were known as separatists. They were originally part of the Church of England, but they didn't agree with the policies and where the Church of England was going and what they expected. So they wanted to separate. They wanted to leave the Church of England and worship in their own way. They experienced a lot of persecution for that. They were fined. They were jailed, at times killed because of their faith. The Church of England is the state church of England, of that country, and it is today. And so at that time, the powers that be did not want any other competing faiths to go on. And even though they were a part of the Church of England, they didn't agree with a lot of the policies and what was happening, and so they wanted to be separate. The Pilgrims didn't want gold, but they came for religious freedom. So on September 1620, the Mayflower, their ship, they left Plymouth, England, and they were headed for down here. They wanted to get to Virginia, and they wanted to establish their colony where, in the vicinity of Jamestown, there were already people there. It was already established, there was trading going on, it was being developed. But they got pushed off course, and they wound up here by modern-day Massachusetts. So this is the problem with this. This area was under the legal control of the king, and the king gave the charter to the Jamestown Company. So they knew there were laws and rules established for how they were going to live there and how they were going to perform. When you get pushed off course like they did, they were out of that jurisdiction. They were out of that authority. The charter that the king gave Jamestown didn't include all the way up to Massachusetts. So now these Pilgrims arrive, they're off course, and there is no authority, there's no rules, there's nothing established for how they should conduct themselves. So, when they first went in 1620, they had 102 people. They were blown off course, didn't have authority. And so, like I just said, so who makes the rules for these new colonies? How do they establish this? And they decided that before they got off the boat to get to land, when they saw land, they anchored offshore, and they created a compact or an agreement. And for them, this was their binding legal agreement as to how they were going to conduct themselves in this new colony. It was the rules, it was the law, and every person on the Mayflower had to agree and sign before departing ship. So everybody had to be in agreement that this is how they were going to live. It was when they got on land. What makes it so important is this is the first time a group of people on their own are establishing rules for self-government. It's not like even with the House of Burgesses, who had the connection still with England, the House of Burgesses in Jamestown. They set rules for how Jamestown was going to do, but it was really under the authority of England. Here, in the Mayflower Compact, there was no other authority than what they made up in this compact. And so the idea of self-government really began to be established here. So in the Mayflower Compact, they arrived in Massachusetts, and they called it Plymouth. They wrote the document before they got off the boat. It was the rules for the colonies, and it was the first time the colonists governed themselves. Now, once they got on land, it was wilderness. There were Native Americans that lived there, but they're used to different homes and different lifestyle, and they had to create and build all these things. So that first year was devastating. Remember, they left in September, so they're spending the first winter up in New England, in Massachusetts. Very cold. Only 44 out of the original 102 survived. Yet, when the Mayflower went to sail back to England, because they had chartered the ship, this group of people paid to have them brought over to North America, none chose to leave. So they were committed. They were like, we're here, we've decided to do it, it's this or death. We're not going to, either we make this work or it's an utter failure, but we're not going to turn back. The fall of 1621, so they go through their first winter, they have spring and summer, and the Native Americans in the area really helped them and showed them how to farm and how to work the land that they were at. So the fall of 1601 is the first Thanksgiving, the feast that the Pilgrims had with the Native Americans. The colony survived with fur and fish and lumber, and it was a tough time that first year. Plymouth stayed small, and economically was not that important. Remember, not only did they want to worship as they pleased, but they also wanted to make money. That wasn't their priority. Their priority was the ability to worship, as they so thought, but you needed to make money to live. So, this colony stayed small, and they mostly produced for themselves. They did a little trading, but it didn't become economically significant, like Jamestown with the tobacco. And by about 80 years later, there were only 7,000 people there, which is a very, very small growth rate over 80 years, and if you remember. So, because it was small, they merged with this other colony that became established by them, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, how did they survive? It was Squanto and the Native Americans. They helped the most. They gave them the seeds for the corn, the beans, the pumpkin. Remember, these are native plants, native foods to North America when we talked about the Columbian Exchange. These were not in Europe at the time. So they had to learn how to grow these foods. They also taught them how to fish and how to fertilize the crops. By the second Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims were well on their way of having plenty of food and becoming quite established. But we have the Pilgrims, that was the first group. Now we have others coming from England. And there was another group that sought religious freedom, and that was the Puritans. And now we're going to look at who were they and why were they different than the Pilgrims. And we'll look at that next video.